man's personal reality in its winged flight. Such a composite symbol is found in other representations as the winged horse or winged dragon, or other creatures that abound in the artistic expressions of alchemy, so fully illustrated in Dr. Jung's classic work on this subject. We follow the innumerable vicissitudes of these symbols in our work with patients. They show what our therapy can expect to achieve when it liberates the deeper psychic contents so that they can become part of our conscious equipment for understanding life more effectively. It is not easy for modern man to grasp the significance of the symbols that come down to us from the past or that appear in our dreams. Nor is it easy to see how the ancient conflict between symbols of containment and liberation relates to our own predicament. Yet it becomes easier when we realize it is only the specific forms of these archaic patterns that change, not their psychic meaning. We have been talking of wild birds as symbols of release or liberation. But today we could as well speak of jet planes and space rockets, for they are the physical embodiment of the same transcendent principle, freeing us, at least temporarily, from gravity. In the same way, the ancient symbols of containment, which once gave stability and protection, now appear in modern man's search for economic security and social welfare. Any of us can see, of course, that there is a conflict in our lives between adventure and discipline, or evil and virtue, or freedom and security. But these are only phrases we use to describe an ambivalence that troubles us, and to which we never seem able to find an answer. There is an answer. There is a meeting point between containment and liberation, and we can find it in the rites of initiation that I have been discussing. They can make it possible for individuals or whole groups of people to unite the opposing forces within themselves and achieve an equilibrium in their lives. But the rites do not offer this opportunity invariably or automatically. They relate to particular phases of life of an individual or of a group, and unless they are properly understood and translated into a new way of life, the moment can pass. Initiation is essentially a process that begins with a rite of submission, followed by a period of containment, and then by a further rite of liberation. In this way, every individual can reconcile the conflicting elements of his personality. He can strike a balance that makes him truly human, and truly the master of himself. Photo captions. A ceremonial mask from the island of New Ireland, New Guinea. Far left. A symbolic ceremony of antiquity in 20th century form. The American astronaut John Glenn in a Washington parade after his orbit of the Earth in 1962. Like a hero of old after a victory, returning home in a triumphal procession. Center left. A cross-like sculpture of a Greek fertility goddess, circa 2500 B.C. Left. Two views of a 12th century Scots stone cross that retains some pagan femaleness, the breasts at the crossbar. Right. Another age-old archetype reborn in a new guise. A Russian poster for an atheistic festival at Easter to replace the Christian festival, just as the Christian Easter was superimposed on earlier pagan solstice rites. Left. A 13th century Japanese scroll painting of the destruction of a city. Below, similarly dominated by flame and smoke, St. Paul's Cathedral, London, during an air raid in World War II. Methods of warfare have changed over the ages, but the emotional impact of war is timeless and archetypal. Top left, Christ's Nativity. Center, his crucifixion. Bottom, his ascension. His birth, death, and rebirth follows the pattern of many ancient hero myths, a pattern originally based on seasonal fertility rites, like those probably held 3,000 years ago at England's Stonehenge, seen below at dawn at the summer solstice. The hero's early proof of strength occurs in most hero myths. Below, the infant Hercules killing two serpents. Top right, the young King Arthur, alone able to draw a magic sword from a stone. Bottom right, America's Davy Crockett, who killed a bear when he was 3. Above, 3 examples of the tutelary or guardian figure that accompanies the archetypal hero. Top, from Greek myth, the centaur Chiron, giving instruction to the youthful Achilles. Center, King Arthur's guardian, the magician Merlin, holding a scroll. Bottom, an instance from modern life, a trainer on whose knowledge and experience a professional boxer often depends. Most heroes must face and overcome various monsters and forces of evil. Top, the Scandinavian hero Sigurd, lower right of picture, slays the serpent Fafnir. Center, the ancient Babylonian epic hero Gilgamesh, battling with a lion. Bottom, the modern American comic strip hero Superman, whose one-man war against crime often requires him to rescue pretty girls. Above, two examples of the hero's betrayal. The biblical hero Samson, top, betrayed by Delilah, and the Persian hero Rustum, led into a trap by a man he trusted. Below, a modern result of hubris, overconfidence. German prisoners in Stalingrad, 1941, after Hitler invaded Russia in winter. Trickster, the first rudimentary stage in the development of the hero myth, in which the hero is instinctual, uninhibited, and often childish. Far left, the 16th century Chinese epic hero Monkey, shown in a modern Peking opera, tricking a river king into giving up a magic staff. Left, on a 6th century BC jar, the infant Hermes in his cradle after having stolen Apollo's cattle. Right, the troublemaking Norse god Loki, a 19th century sculpture. Far right, Charlie Chaplin creating a disturbance in the 1936 film Modern Times, a 20th century trickster. The second stage in the evolution of the hero is the founder of human culture. Left, a Navajo sand painting of the myth of Coyote, who stole fire from the gods and gave it to man. In Greek myth, Prometheus also stole fire from the gods for man, for which he was chained to a rock and tortured by an eagle, below on a 6th century BC cup. The hero in the third stage is a powerful man-god, like Buddha. In the 1st century sculpture above, Siddhartha begins the journey on which he will receive enlightenment and become Buddha. Below left, a medieval Italian sculpture of Romulus and Remus, the twins raised by a wolf, who founded Rome, and who are the best-known instance of the 4th stage of the hero myth. In the 4th stage, the twins often misused their power, as did the Roman heroes Castor and Pollux when they abducted the daughters of Leucippus, below in a painting by the Flemish artist Rubens. An individual psyche develops, as does the hero myth, from a primitive childish stage, and often images of the early stages can appear in the dreams of psychologically immature adults. The first stage might be represented by the carefree play of children, like the pillow fight, far left, from the 1933 French film Zéro de Conduite. The second stage might be the reckless thrill-seeking of early adolescence. Right, American youths test their nerves in a speeding car. A later stage can produce idealism and self-sacrifice in late adolescence, exemplified in the picture, opposite, far right, taken during the East Berlin Rising, June 1953, when young men fought Russian tanks with stones. The young, undifferentiated ego personality is protected by the mother, a protection imaged by the sheltering Madonna, left, in a painting by the 15th century Italian artist Piero della Francesca, or by the Egyptian sky goddess Nut, right, bending over the earth, in a 5th century BC relief. But the ego must eventually free itself from unconsciousness and immaturity, and its battle for deliverance is often symbolized by a hero's battle with a monster, like the Japanese god Susanu's battle with a serpent, top right, in a 19th century print. The hero doesn't always win at once. For instance, Jonah was swallowed by the whale, far right, from a 14th century manuscript. The ego's emergence can be symbolized not by a battle, but by a sacrifice, death leading to rebirth. Revolution is sacrificial in this way. Delacroix's painting, below, Greece expiring on the ruins of Missolonghi, personifies the country killed by civil war to be liberated and reborn, as individual sacrifices, The British poet Byron, above, died in Greece during the Revolution, 1824. Below left, the Christian martyr St. Lucia sacrificed her eyes and her life for her religion. Below, a montage of World War I, a call to arms poster, infantry, a military cemetery. Memorials and religious services for soldiers who gave their lives for their country often reflect the cyclic death and rebirth theme of the archetypal heroic sacrifice. An inscription on one British memorial to the dead of World War I reads, "At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them." In mythology, a hero's death is often due to his own hubris, which causes the gods to humble him. As a modern example, in 1912 the ship Titanic struck an iceberg and sank. Right, a montage of scenes of the sinking from the 1943 film Titanic. Yet the Titanic had been called unsinkable. According to the American author Walter Lord, one sailor was heard to say, "God himself couldn't sink this ship." Heroes often fight monsters to rescue damsels in distress, who symbolize the anima. Left, St. George slays a dragon to free a maiden, in a 15th century Italian painting. Right, in the 1916 film The Great Secret, the dragon has become a locomotive, but the heroic rescue remains the same. Some heroic battles and rescues from Greek myth. Far left, Perseus slays Medusa on a 6th century BC vase. Left, Perseus with Andromeda, from a 1st century BC mural, whom he saved from a monster. Right, Theseus kills the Minotaur on a 1st century BC jar, watched by Ariadne. Below, on a Cretan coin, 67 BC, the Minotaur's labyrinth. The hero's rescue of a maiden can symbolize the freeing of the anima from the devouring aspect of the mother. This aspect is represented, far left, by Balinese dancers wearing the mask of Rangda, left, a malign female spirit, or by the serpent that swallowed and then regurgitated the Greek hero Jason, above. As in the dream discussed in this chapter, a common anima symbol is a harbor town. Below, a poster by Marc Chagall personifies Nice as a mermaid. A primitive tribe's totem, often an animal, symbolizes each tribesman's identity with the tribal unit. Left, an Australian aborigine imitating, in a ritual dance, his tribe's totem, an emu. Many modern groups use totem-like animals as emblems. Below, a heraldic lion from the Belgian coat of arms on a 17th century allegorical map of Belgium. Right, the falcon is the mascot of the American Air Force Academy's football team. Far right, modern totemistic emblems that aren't animals. A shop window display of ties, badges, etc., of British schools and clubs. Primitive initiation rituals bring the youth into adulthood and into the tribe's collective identity. In many primitive societies, initiation is accomplished by circumcision, a symbolic sacrifice. Here are 4 stages in a circumcision rite of Australian Aborigines. Far left, top, and center. The boys are placed under blankets, a symbolic death from which they will be reborn. Bottom, they are removed and held by the men for the actual operation. Left, the circumcised boys are given men's conical caps, a mark of their new status. Right, they are finally isolated from the tribe to be purified and given instruction. A sarcophagus from 2nd century A.D. Thebes that reveals a symbolic connection with the archetypal Great Mother, the container of all life. The inside of the cover bears a portrait of the Egyptian goddess Nut. Thus the goddess would embrace the body of the deceased, whose portrait is on the base, far right. 4 varied initiation ceremonies. Top left, novices in a convent perform such humble duties as scrubbing a floor, from the 1958 film The Nun's Story, and have their hair cut off, from a medieval painting. Center, ship's passengers crossing the equator must undergo a rite of passage. Bottom, American college freshmen in a traditional battle with their seniors. Marriage can be seen as an initiation rite in which the man and the woman must submit to one another. But in some societies the man offsets his submission by ritually abducting his bride, as to the Dayaks of Malaysia and Borneo. Right, from the 1955 film The Lost Continent. A remnant of this practice exists in today's custom of carrying the bride across the threshold. Far right. The archetypal sacred marriage, the union of opposites, of the male and female principles, represented here by a 19th century Indian sculpture of the deities Shiva and Parvati. 3 scenes from the 1946 film of Beauty and the Beast, directed by Francis Jean Cocteau. Left, Beauty's father caught stealing the white rose from the beast's garden. Right, the beast dying. Far right, the beast transformed into a prince walking with Beauty. The story can be said to symbolize a young girl's initiation, that is, her release from her bond with her father in order to come to terms with the erotic animal side of her nature. Until this is done, she cannot achieve a true relationship with a man. Above, the Greek god Dionysus ecstatically playing the lute in a vase painting. The frenzied and orgiastic rites of the Dionysiac cults symbolized initiation into nature's mysteries. Right, Maenads worshipping Dionysus. Far right, satyrs in the same wild worship. Above, a Dionysiac ritual depicted on the great fresco in the Villa of the Mysteries at Pompeii. In the center, an initiate is offered the ceremonial cup of Dionysus, in which he sees a reflection of the god mask held behind. This is a symbolic infusion of the drink with the god's spirit, which can be said to parallel the Roman Catholic ceremony of elevating the chalice during Mass, below. Left, Orpheus charming the beasts with his song, in a Roman mosaic. Above, the murder of Orpheus by Thracian women on a Greek vase. Below left, Christ as the Good Shepherd, a 6th century mosaic. Both Orpheus and Christ parallel the archetype of the man of nature, also reflected in the painting by Cranach, below, of natural man's innocence. Facing page, left, the 18th century French philosopher Rousseau, who put forward the idea of the noble savage, the simple child of nature, free of sin and evil. Far right, the title page of Walden, by the 19th century American writer Thoreau, who believed in and followed a natural way of life almost wholly independent of civilization. Above left, the Persian god Mithras sacrificing the bull. The sacrifice, also part of Dionysiac rites, can be seen as a symbol of the victory of man's spiritual nature over his animality, of which the bull is a common symbol. This may explain the popularity in some countries of bullfighting. Left. Right. An etching by Picasso, 1935, depicts a girl threatened by a minotaur. Here, as in the myth of Theseus, a symbol of man's uncontrollable instinctive forces. Both a bird and a shaman, that is, a primitive medicine man, are common symbols of transcendence, and often are combined. Left, a prehistoric cave painting at Lascaux shows a shaman in a bird mask. Below, a shaman priestess of a Siberian people in a bird costume. Right, a shaman's coffin, also Siberian, with bird figures on the posts. In myths or dreams, a lonely journey often symbolizes the liberation of transcendence. Above left, a 15th century painting of the poet Dante holding his book, The Divine Comedy, which relates his dream of a journey to hell, lower left of picture, purgatory, and heaven. Far left, an engraving of the journey made by the pilgrim in the British author John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, 1678. Note that the journey is a circular movement toward an inner center. This book, too, is told as a dream. Left, the pilgrim dreaming. Many people want some change from a containing pattern of life, but the freedom gained by travel, urged by the runaway to sea poster, right, is no substitute for a true inner liberation. Left, the British explorer R.F. Scott and his companions, photographed in the Antarctic in 1911. Explorers venturing into the unknown provide an apt image of the liberation, the breaking out of containment that characterizes transcendence. The symbol of the snake is commonly linked with transcendence because it was traditionally a creature of the underworld and thus was a mediator between one way of life and another. Right, the snake and staff symbol of the Greco-Roman god of medicine, Asclepius, on a card used to identify a doctor's car in modern France. Left, a 17th century French painting reveals the snake's role as mediator between this world and the next. Orpheus is playing his lyre. He and his audience fail to notice that Eurydice, center of picture, has been bitten by a snake, a fatal wound that symbolizes her descent into the underworld. Above, the Egyptian god Thoth, with the head of a bird, an ibis, in a relief from circa 350 BC. Thoth is an underworld figure associated with transcendence. It was he who judged the souls of the dead. The Greek god Hermes, who was called Psychopomp, soul guide, had the function of guiding the dead to the underworld. Left, a stone herm, which was placed at crossroads, symbolizing the god's role as a mediator between two worlds. On the side of the herm is a snake twined around a staff. This symbol, the caduceus, was carried over to the Roman god Mercury, right, a 16th century Italian bronze, who also acquired wings, recalling the bird as a symbol of spiritual transcendence. Winged dragons, above, from a 15th century manuscript, combine the transcendent symbolism of the snake and the bird. Right, an image of spiritual transcendence. Muhammad, on the winged mare Burak, flies through the celestial spheres. In the dreams and fantasies of many modern people, the flights of the great rockets of space research have often appeared as symbolic 20th century embodiments of the urge toward liberation and release that is called transcendence. End of photo captions. Part 3. The Process of Individuation by M. L. von Franz. The Pattern of Psychic Growth. At the beginning of this book, Dr. C. G. Jung introduced the reader to the concept of the unconscious, its personal and collective structures, and its symbolic mode of expression. Once one has seen the vital importance, that is, the healing or destructive impact of the symbols produced by the unconscious, there remains the difficult problem of interpretation. Dr. Jung has shown that everything depends on whether any particular interpretation clicks and is meaningful to the individual concerned. In this way, he has indicated the possible meaning and function of dream symbolism. But in the development of Jung's theory, this possibility raised another question. What is the purpose of the total dream life of the individual? What role do dreams play, not only in the immediate psychic economy of the human being, but in his life as a whole? By observing a great many people and studying their dreams, he estimated that he interpreted at least 80,000 dreams, Jung discovered not only that all dreams are relevant in varying degrees to the life of the dreamer, but that they are all parts of one great web of psychological factors. He also found that on the whole they seem to follow an arrangement or pattern. This pattern Jung called the process of individuation. Since dreams produce different scenes and images every night, people who are not careful observers will probably be unaware of any pattern. But if one watches one's own dreams over a period of years and studies the entire sequence, one will see that certain contents emerge, disappear, and then turn up again. Many people even dream repeatedly of the same figures, landscapes, or situations, and if one follows these through a whole series, one will see that they change slowly but perceptibly. These changes can be accelerated if the dreamer's conscious attitude is influenced by appropriate interpretation of the dreams and their symbolic contents. Thus, our dream life creates a meandering pattern in which individual strands or tendencies become visible, then vanish, then return again. If one watches this meandering design over a long period of time, one can observe a sort of hidden regulating or directing tendency at work, creating a slow, imperceptible process of psychic growth, the process of individuation. Gradually, a wider and more mature personality emerges, and by degrees becomes effective and even visible to others. The fact that we often speak of arrested development shows that we assume that such a process of growth and maturation is possible with every individual. Since this psychic growth cannot be brought about by a conscious effort of willpower, but happens involuntarily and naturally, it is in dreams frequently symbolized by the tree, whose slow, powerful, involuntary growth fulfills a definite pattern. The organizing center from which the regulatory effect stems seems to be a sort of nuclear atom in our psychic system. One could also call it the inventor, organizer, and source of dream images. Jung called this center the self, and described it as the totality of the whole psyche, in order to distinguish it from the ego, which constitutes only a small part of the total psyche. Throughout the ages, men have been intuitively aware of the existence of such an inner center. The Greeks called it man's inner daimon. In Egypt, it was expressed by the concept of the Ba-soul, and the Romans worshipped it as the genius native to each individual. In more primitive societies, it was often thought of as a protective spirit embodied within an animal, or a fetish. This inner center is realized in exceptionally pure, unspoiled form by the Naskapi Indians, who still exist in the forests of the Labrador Peninsula. These simple people are hunters who live in isolated family groups so far from one another that they have not been able to evolve tribal customs or collective religious beliefs and ceremonies. In his lifelong solitude, the Naskapi hunter has to rely on his own inner voices and unconscious revelations. He has no religious teachers who tell him what he should believe, no rituals, festivals, or customs to help him along. In his basic view of life, the soul of man is simply an inner companion, whom he calls my friend, or Mr. Pio, meaning great man. Mr. Pio dwells in the heart and is immortal. In the moment of death, or shortly before, he leaves the individual, and later reincarnates himself in another being. Those Naskapi who pay attention to their dreams, and who try to find their meaning and test their truth, can enter into a deeper connection with the great man. He favors such people, and sends them more and better dreams. Thus, the major obligation of an individual Naskapi is to follow the instructions given by his dreams, and then to give permanent form to their contents in art. Lies and dishonesty drive the great man away from one's inner realm, whereas generosity and love of one's neighbors and of animals attract him and give him life. Dreams give the Naskapi complete ability to find his way in life, not only in the inner world, but also in the outer world of nature. They help him to foretell the weather and give him invaluable guidance in his hunting, upon which his life depends. I mention these very primitive people because they are uncontaminated by our civilized ideas and still have natural insight into the essence of what Jung calls the self. The self can be defined as an inner guiding factor that is different from the conscious personality and that can be grasped only through the investigation of one's own dreams. These show it to be the regulating center that brings about a constant extension and maturing of the personality. But this larger, more nearly total aspect of the psyche appears first as merely an inborn possibility. It may emerge very slightly, or it may develop relatively completely during one's lifetime. How far it develops depends on whether or not the ego is willing to listen to the messages of the self. Just as the Naskapi have noticed that a person who is receptive to the hints of the great man gets better and more helpful dreams, we could add that the inborn great man becomes more real within the receptive person than in those who neglect him. Such a person also becomes a more complete human being. It even seems as if the ego has not been produced by nature to follow its own arbitrary impulses to an unlimited extent, but to help to make real the totality, the whole psyche. It is the ego that serves to light up the entire system, allowing it to become conscious and thus to be realized. If, for example, I have an artistic talent of which my ego is not conscious, nothing will happen to it. The gift may as well be non-existent. Only if my ego notices it can I bring it into reality. The inborn but hidden totality of the psyche is not the same thing as a wholeness that is fully realized and lived. One could picture this in the following way. The seed of a mountain pine contains the whole future tree in a latent form, but each seed falls at a certain time onto a particular place in which there are a number of special factors, such as the quality of the soil and the stones, the slope of the land, and its exposure to sun and wind. The latent totality of the pine in the seed reacts to these circumstances by avoiding the stones and inclining toward the sun, with the result that the tree's growth is shaped. Thus an individual pine slowly comes into existence, constituting the fulfillment of its totality, its emergence into the realm of reality. Without the living tree, the image of the pine is only a possibility or an abstract idea. Again, the realization of this uniqueness in the individual man is the goal of the process of individuation. From one point of view, this process takes place in man, as well as in every other living being, by itself and in the unconscious. It is a process by which man lives out his innate human nature. Strictly speaking, however, the process of individuation is real only if the individual is aware of it and consequently makes a living connection with it. We do not know whether the pine tree is aware of its own growth, whether it enjoys and suffers the different vicissitudes that shape it. But man certainly is able to participate consciously in his development. He even feels that from time to time, by making free decisions, he can cooperate actively with it. This cooperation belongs to the process of individuation in the narrower sense of the word. Man, however, experiences something that is not contained in our metaphor of the pine tree. The individuation process is more than a coming to terms between the inborn germ of wholeness and the outer acts of fate. Its subjective experience conveys the feeling that some suprapersonal force is actively interfering in a creative way. One sometimes feels that the unconscious is leading the way in accordance with a secret design. It is as if something is looking at me, something that I do not see, but that sees me. Perhaps that great man in the heart, who tells me his opinions about me by means of dreams. But this creatively active aspect of the psychic nucleus can come into play only when the ego gets rid of all purposive and wishful aims and tries to get to a deeper, more basic form of existence. The ego must be able to listen attentively and to give itself, without any further design or purpose, to that inner urge toward growth. Many existentialist philosophers try to describe this state, but they go only as far as stripping off the illusions of consciousness. They go right up to the door of the unconscious and then fail to open it. People living in cultures more securely rooted than our own have less trouble in understanding that it is necessary to give up the utilitarian attitude of conscious planning in order to make way for the inner growth of the personality. I once met an elderly lady who had not achieved much in her life in terms of outward achievement, but she had in fact made a good marriage with a difficult husband and had somehow developed into a mature personality. When she complained to me that she had not done anything in her life, I told her a story related by a Chinese sage, Zhuangzi. She understood immediately and felt great relief. This is the story. A wandering carpenter called Stone saw on his travels a gigantic old oak tree standing in a field near an earth altar. The carpenter said to his apprentice, who was admiring the oak, "This is a useless tree. If you wanted to make a ship, it would soon rot. If you wanted to make tools, they would break. You can't do anything useful with this tree, and that's why it has become so old." But in an inn, that same evening, when the carpenter went to sleep, the old oak tree appeared to him in his dream and said, "Why do you compare me to your cultivated trees, such as whitethorn, pear, orange, and apple trees, and all the others that bear fruit? Even before they can ripen their fruit, people attack and violate them. Their branches are broken, their twigs are torn. Their own gifts bring harm to them, and they cannot live out their natural span. That is what happens everywhere, and that is why I have long since tried to become completely useless. You poor mortal! Imagine, if I had been useful in any way, would I have reached this size? Furthermore, you and I are both creatures, and how can one creature set himself so high as to judge another creature? You useless mortal man, what do you know about useless trees?" The carpenter woke up and meditated upon his dream, and later, when his apprentice asked him why just this one tree served to protect the earth altar, he answered, "Keep your mouth shut. Let's hear no more about it. The tree grew here on purpose, because anywhere else people would have ill-treated it. If it were not the tree of the earth altar, it might have been chopped down." The carpenter obviously understood his dream. He saw that simply to fulfill one's destiny is the greatest human achievement, and that our utilitarian notions have to give way in the face of the demands of our unconscious psyche. If we translate this metaphor into psychological language, the tree symbolizes the process of individuation, giving a lesson to our short-sighted ego. Under the tree that fulfilled its destiny, there was, in Zhuangzi's story, an earth altar. This was a crude, unwrought stone upon which people made sacrifices to the local god who owned this piece of land. The symbol of the earth altar points to the fact that in order to bring the individuation process into reality, one must surrender consciously to the power of the unconscious, instead of thinking in terms of what one should do, or of what is generally thought right, or of what usually happens. One must simply listen, in order to learn what the inner totality, the self, wants one to do here and now in a particular situation. Note, the local god to whom sacrifices were made on the stone earth altar corresponds in many respects to the antique genius loci. See Henri Maspero, La Chine Antique, Paris, 1955, page 140 and following. This information is owed to the kindness of Miss Ariane Rump. End of note. Our attitude must be like that of the mountain pine mentioned above. It does not get annoyed when its growth is obstructed by a stone, nor does it make plans about how to overcome the obstacles. It merely tries to feel whether it should grow more toward the left or the right, toward the slope or away from it. Like the tree, we should give in to this almost imperceptible yet powerfully dominating impulse, an impulse that comes from the urge toward unique, creative self-realization. And this is a process in which one must repeatedly seek out and find something that is not yet known to anyone. The guiding hints or impulses come not from the ego, but from the totality of the psyche, the self. It is, moreover, useless to cast furtive glances at the way someone else is developing, because each of us has a unique task of self-realization. Although many human problems are similar, they are never identical. All pine trees are very much alike, otherwise we should not recognize them as pines, yet none is exactly the same as another. Because of these factors of sameness and difference, it is difficult to summarize the infinite variations of the process of individuation. The fact is that each person has to do something different, something that is uniquely his own. Many people have criticized the Jungian approach for not presenting psychic material systematically. But these critics forget that the material itself is a living experience charged with emotion, by nature irrational and ever-changing, which does not lend itself to systematization except in the most superficial fashion. Modern depth psychology has here reached the same limits that confront microphysics. That is, when we are dealing with statistical averages, a rational and systematic description of the facts is possible, but when we are attempting to describe a single psychic event, we can do no more than present an honest picture of it from as many angles as possible. In the same way, scientists have to admit that they do not know what light is. They can say only that in certain experimental conditions it seems to consist of particles, while in other experimental conditions it seems to consist of waves. But what it is in itself is not known. The psychology of the unconscious and any description of the process of individuation encounter comparable difficulties of definition, but I will try here to give a sketch of some of their most typical features. The first approach of the unconscious. For most people, the years of youth are characterized by a state of gradual awakening, in which the individual slowly becomes aware of the world and of himself. Childhood is a period of great emotional intensity, and a child's earliest dreams often manifest in symbolic form the basic structure of the psyche, indicating how it will later shape the destiny of the individual concerned. For example, Jung once told a group of students about a young woman who was so haunted by anxiety that she committed suicide at the age of 26. As a small child, she had dreamed that Jack Frost had entered her room while she was lying in bed and pinched her on the stomach. She woke and discovered that she had pinched herself with her own hand. The dream did not frighten her. She merely remembered that she had had such a dream. But the fact that she did not react emotionally to her strange encounter with the demon of the cold, of congealed life, did not augur well for the future, and was itself abnormal. It was with a cold, unfeeling hand that she later put an end to her life. From this single dream it is possible to deduce the tragic fate of the dreamer, which was anticipated by her psyche in childhood. Sometimes it is not a dream, but some very impressive and unforgettable real event that, like a prophecy, anticipates the future in symbolic form. It is well known that children often forget events that seem impressive to adults, but keep a vivid recollection of some incident or story that no one else has noticed. When we look into one of these childhood memories, we usually find that it depicts, if interpreted as if it were a symbol, a basic problem of the child's psychic makeup. When a child reaches school age, the phase of building up the ego and of adapting to the outer world begins. This phase generally brings a number of painful shocks. At the same time, some children begin to feel very different from others, and this feeling of being unique brings a certain sadness that is part of the loneliness of many youngsters. The imperfections of the world and the evil within oneself as well as outside become conscious problems. The child must try to cope with urgent but not yet understood inner impulses as well as the demands of the outer world. If the development of consciousness is disturbed in its normal unfolding, children frequently retire from outer or inner difficulties into an inner fortress, and when that happens, their dreams and symbolic drawings of unconscious material often reveal to an unusual degree a type of circular, quadrangular, and nuclear motif, which I will explain later. This refers to the previously mentioned psychic nucleus, the vital center of the personality from which the whole structural development of consciousness stems. It is natural that the image of the center should appear in an especially striking way when the psychic life of the individual is threatened. From this central nucleus, as far as we know today, the whole building up of ego consciousness is directed, the ego apparently being a duplicate or structural counterpart of the original center. In this early phase, there are many children who earnestly seek for some meaning in life that could help them to deal with the chaos both within and outside themselves. There are others, however, who are still unconsciously carried along by the dynamism of inherited and instinctive archetypal patterns. These young people are not concerned about the deeper meaning of life because their experiences with love, nature, sport, and work contain an immediate and satisfying meaning for them. They are not necessarily more superficial. Usually they are carried by the stream of life with less friction and disturbance than their more introspective fellows. If I travel in a car or train without looking out, it is only the stops, starts, and sudden turns that make me realize I am moving at all. The actual process of individuation, the conscious coming to terms with one's own inner center, psychic nucleus, or self, generally begins with a wounding of the personality and the suffering that accompanies it. This initial shock amounts to a sort of call, although it is not often recognized as such. On the contrary, the ego feels hampered in its will or its desire, and usually projects the obstruction onto something external. That is, the ego accuses God or the economic situation or the boss or the marriage partner of being responsible for whatever is obstructing it. Or perhaps everything seems outwardly all right, but beneath the surface, a person is suffering from a deadly boredom that makes everything seem meaningless and empty. Many myths and fairy tales symbolically describe this initial stage in the process of individuation by telling of a king who has fallen ill or grown old. Other familiar story patterns are that a royal couple is barren, or that a monster steals all the women, children, horses, and wealth of the kingdom, or that a demon keeps the king's army or his ship from proceeding on its course, or that darkness hangs over the lands, wells dry up, and flood, drought, and frost afflict the country. Thus it seems as if the initial encounter with the self casts a dark shadow ahead of time, or as if the inner friend comes at first like a trapper to catch the helplessly struggling ego in his snare. In myths, one finds that the magic or talisman that can cure the misfortune of the king or his country always proves to be something very special. In one tale, a white blackbird, or a fish that carries a golden ring in its gills, is needed to restore the king's health. In another, the king wants the water of life, or 3 golden hairs from the head of the devil, or a woman's golden plate, and afterward, naturally, the owner of the plate. Whatever it is, the thing that can drive away the evil is always unique and hard to find. It is exactly the same in the initial crisis in the life of an individual. One is seeking something that is impossible to find, or about which nothing is known. In such moments, all well-meant, sensible advice is completely useless. Advice that urges one to try to be responsible, to take a holiday, not to work so hard, or to work harder, to have more or less human contact, or to take up a hobby. None of that helps, or at best only rarely. There is only one thing that seems to work, and that is to turn directly toward the approaching darkness, without prejudice and totally naively, and to try to find out what its secret aim is, and what it wants from you. The hidden purpose of the oncoming darkness is generally something so unusual, so unique and unexpected, that as a rule one can find out what it is only by means of dreams and fantasies welling up from the unconscious. If one focuses attention on the unconscious without rash assumptions or emotional rejection, it often breaks through in a flow of helpful symbolic images, but not always. Sometimes it first offers a series of painful realizations of what is wrong with one's self and one's conscious attitudes. Then one must begin the process by swallowing all sorts of bitter truths. The realization of the shadow. Whether the unconscious comes up at first in a helpful or a negative form, after a time the need usually arises to readapt the conscious attitude in a better way to the unconscious factors, therefore to accept what seems to be criticism from the unconscious. Through dreams, one becomes acquainted with aspects of one's own personality that for various reasons one has preferred not to look at too closely. This is what Jung called the realization of the shadow. He used the term shadow for this unconscious part of the personality because it actually often appears in dreams in a personified form. The shadow is not the whole of the unconscious personality. It represents unknown or little-known attributes and qualities of the ego, aspects that mostly belong to the personal sphere and that could just as well be conscious. In some aspects, the shadow can also consist of collective factors that stem from a source outside the individual's personal life. When an individual makes an attempt to see his shadow, he becomes aware of, and often ashamed of, those qualities and impulses he denies in himself but can plainly see in other people, such things as egotism, mental laziness and sloppiness, unreal fantasies, schemes and plots, carelessness and cowardice, inordinate love of money and possessions, in short, all the little sins about which he might previously have told himself, "That doesn't matter. Nobody will notice it, and in any case other people do it too." If you feel an overwhelming rage coming up in you when a friend reproaches you about a fault, you can be fairly sure that at this point you will find a part of your shadow of which you are unconscious. It is, of course, natural to become annoyed when others who are no better criticize you because of shadow faults. But what can you say if your own dreams, an inner judge in your own being, reproach you? That is the moment when the ego gets caught, and the result is usually embarrassed silence. Afterward, the painful and lengthy work of self-education begins, a work, we might say, that is the psychological equivalent of the labors of Hercules. This unfortunate hero's first task, you will remember, was to clean up in one day the Augean stables, in which hundreds of cattle had dropped their dung for many decades, a task so enormous that the ordinary mortal would be overcome by discouragement at the mere thought of it. The shadow does not consist only of omissions. It shows up just as often in an impulsive or inadvertent act. Before one has time to think, the evil remark pops out, the plot is hatched, the wrong decision is made, and one is confronted with results that were never intended or consciously wanted. Furthermore, the shadow is exposed to collective infections to a much greater extent than is the conscious personality. When a man is alone, for instance, he feels relatively all right. But as soon as the others do dark, primitive things, he begins to fear that if he doesn't join in, he will be considered a fool. Thus he gives way to impulses that do not really belong to him at all. It is particularly in contacts with people of the same sex that one stumbles over both one's own shadow and those of other people. Although we do see the shadow in a person of the opposite sex, we are usually much less annoyed by it and can more easily pardon it. In dreams and myths, therefore, the shadow appears as a person of the same sex as that of the dreamer. The following dream may serve as an example. The dreamer was a man of 48 who tried to live very much for and by himself, working hard and disciplining himself, repressing pleasure and spontaneity to a far greater extent than suited his real nature. I owned and inhabited a very big house in town, and I didn't yet know all its different parts, so I took a walk through it and discovered, mainly in the cellar, several rooms about which I knew nothing, and even exits leading into other cellars or into subterranean streets. I felt uneasy when I found that several of these exits were not locked, and some had no locks at all. Moreover, there were some laborers at work in the neighborhood who could have sneaked in. When I came up again to the ground floor, I passed a backyard where again I discovered different exits into the street or into other houses. When I tried to investigate them more closely, a man came up to me laughing loudly and calling out that we were old pals from the elementary school. I remembered him, too, and while he was telling me about his life, I walked along with him toward the exit and strolled with him through the streets. There was a strange chiaroscuro in the air as we walked through an enormous circular street and arrived at a green lawn where 3 galloping horses suddenly passed us. They were beautiful, strong animals, wild but well-groomed, and they had no rider with them. Had they run away from military service? The maze of strange passages, chambers, and unlocked exits in the cellar recalls the old Egyptian representation of the underworld, which is a well-known symbol of the unconscious with its unknown possibilities. It also shows how one is open to other influences in one's unconscious shadow side and how uncanny and alien elements can break in. The cellar, one can say, is the basement of the dreamer's psyche. In the backyard of the strange building, which represents the still unperceived psychic scope of the dreamer's personality, an old school friend suddenly turns up. This person obviously personifies another aspect of the dreamer himself, an aspect that had been part of his life as a child, but that he had forgotten and lost. It often happens that a person's childhood qualities, for instance, gaiety, irascibility, or perhaps trustfulness, suddenly disappear, and one does not know where or how they have gone. It is such a lost characteristic of the dreamer that now returns from the backyard and tries to make friends again. This figure probably stands for the dreamer's neglected capacity for enjoying life and for his extroverted shadow side. But we soon learn why the dreamer feels uneasy just before meeting this seemingly harmless old friend. When he strolls with him in the street, the horses break loose. The dreamer thinks they may have escaped from military service, that is to say, from the conscious discipline that has hitherto characterized his life. The fact that the horses have no rider shows that instinctive drives can get away from conscious control. In this old friend and in the horses, all the positive force reappears that was lacking before and that was badly needed by the dreamer. This is a problem that often comes up when one meets one's other side. The shadow usually contains values that are needed by consciousness, but that exist in a form that makes it difficult to integrate them into one's life. The passages and the large house in this dream also show that the dreamer does not yet know his own psychic dimensions and is not yet able to fill them out. The shadow in this dream is typical for an introvert, a man who tends to retire too much from outer life. In the case of an extrovert, who is turned more toward outer objects and outer life, the shadow would look quite different. A young man who had a very lively temperament embarked again and again on successful enterprises, while at the same time his dreams insisted that he should finish off a piece of private creative work he had begun. The following was one of those dreams. A man is lying on a couch and has pulled the cover over his face. He is a Frenchman, a desperado who would take on any criminal job. An official is accompanying me downstairs, and I know that a plot has been made against me, namely, that the Frenchman should kill me as if by chance. That is how it would look from the outside. He actually sneaks up behind me when we approach the exit, but I am on my guard. A tall, portly man, rather rich and influential, suddenly leans against the wall beside me, feeling ill. I quickly grab the opportunity to kill the official by stabbing his heart. One only notices a bit of moisture. This is said like a comment. Now I am safe, for the Frenchman won't attack me, since the man who gave him his orders is dead. Probably the official and the successful portly man are the same person, the latter somehow replacing the former. The desperado represents the other side of the dreamer, his introversion, which has reached a completely destitute state. He lies on a couch, that is, he is passive, and pulls the cover over his face because he wants to be left alone. The official, on the other hand, and the prosperous portly man, who are secretly the same person, personify the dreamer's successful outer responsibilities and activities. The sudden illness of the portly man is connected with the fact that this dreamer had in fact become ill several times when he had allowed his dynamic energy to explode too forcibly in his external life. But this successful man has no blood in his veins, only a sort of moisture, which means that these external ambitious activities of the dreamer contain no genuine life and no passion, but are bloodless mechanisms. Thus it would be no real loss if the portly man were killed. At the end of the dream, the Frenchman is satisfied. He obviously represents a positive shadow figure who had turned negative and dangerous only because the conscious attitude of the dreamer did not agree with him. This dream shows us that the shadow can consist of many different elements, for instance, of unconscious ambition, the successful portly man, and of introversion, the Frenchman. This particular dreamer's association to the French, moreover, was that they know how to handle love affairs very well. Therefore, the two shadow figures also represent two well-known drives, power and sex. The power drive appears momentarily in a double form, both as an official and as a successful man. The official, or civil servant, personifies collective adaptation, whereas the successful man denotes ambition. But naturally, both serve the power drive. When the dreamer succeeds in stopping this dangerous inner force, the Frenchman is suddenly no longer hostile. In other words, the equally dangerous aspect of the sex drive has also surrendered. Obviously, the problem of the shadow plays a great role in all political conflicts. If the man who had this dream had not been sensible about his shadow problem, he could easily have identified the desperate Frenchman with the dangerous communists of outer life, or the official plus the prosperous man with the grasping capitalists. In this way, he would have avoided seeing that he had within him such warring elements. If people observe their own unconscious tendencies in other people, this is called a projection. Political agitation in all countries is full of such projections, just as much as the backyard gossip of little groups and individuals. Projections of all kinds obscure our view of our fellow men, spoiling its objectivity, and thus spoiling all possibility of genuine human relationships. And there is an additional disadvantage in projecting our shadow. If we identify our own shadow with, say, the communists or the capitalists, a part of our own personality remains on the opposing side. The result is that we shall constantly, though involuntarily, do things behind our own backs that support this other side, and thus we shall unwittingly help our enemy. If, on the contrary, we realize the projection and can discuss matters without fear or hostility, dealing with the other person sensibly, then there is a chance of mutual understanding, or at least of a truce. Whether the shadow becomes our friend or enemy depends largely upon ourselves. As the dreams of the unexplored house and the French desperado both show, the shadow is not necessarily always an opponent. In fact, he is exactly like any human being with whom one has to get along, sometimes by giving in, sometimes by resisting, sometimes by giving love, whatever the situation requires. The shadow becomes hostile only when he is ignored or misunderstood, Sometimes, though not often, an individual feels impelled to live out the worst side of his nature and to repress his better side. In such cases, the shadow appears as a positive figure in his dreams. But to a person who lives out his natural emotions and feelings, the shadow may appear as a cold and negative intellectual. It then personifies poisonous judgments and negative thoughts that have been held back. So whatever form it takes, the function of the shadow is to represent the opposite side of the ego and to embody just those qualities that one dislikes most in other people. It would be relatively easy if one could integrate the shadow into the conscious personality just by attempting to be honest and to use one's insight. But unfortunately, such an attempt does not always work. There is such a passionate drive within the shadowy part of oneself that reason may not prevail against it. A bitter experience coming from the outside may occasionally help. A brick, so to speak, has to drop on one's head to put a stop to shadow drives and impulses. At times, a heroic decision may serve to halt them, but such a superhuman effort is usually possible only if the great man within, the self, helps the individual to carry it through. The fact that the shadow contains the overwhelming power of irresistible impulse does not mean, however, that the drive should always be heroically repressed. Sometimes the shadow is powerful because the urge of the self is pointing in the same direction, and so one does not know whether it is the self or the shadow that is behind the inner pressure. In the unconscious, one is unfortunately in the same situation as in a moonlit landscape. All the contents are blurred and merge into one another, and one never knows exactly what or where anything is, or where one thing begins and ends. This is known as the contamination of unconscious contents. When Jung called one aspect of the unconscious personality the shadow, he was referring to a relatively well-defined factor. But sometimes everything that is unknown to the ego is mixed up with the shadow, including even the most valuable and highest forces. Who, for instance, could be quite sure whether the French desperado in the dream I quoted was a useless tramp or a most valuable introvert? And the bolting horses of the preceding dream, should they be allowed to run free or not? In a case when the dream itself does not make things clear, the conscious personality will have to make the decision. If the shadow figure contains valuable, vital forces, they ought to be assimilated into actual experience and not repressed. It is up to the ego to give up its pride and priggishness and to live out something that seems to be dark, but actually may not be. This can require a sacrifice just as heroic as the conquest of passion, but in an opposite sense. The ethical difficulties that arise when one meets one's shadow are well described in the 18th book of the Quran. In this tale, Moses meets Khidr, the Green One, or first angel of God, in the desert. They wander along together, and Khidr expresses his fear that Moses will not be able to witness his deeds without indignation. If Moses cannot bear with him and trust him, Khidr will have to leave. Presently, Khidr scuttles the fishing boat of some poor villagers. Then, before Moses' eyes, he kills a handsome young man, and finally he restores the fallen wall of a city of unbelievers. Moses cannot help expressing his indignation, and so Khidr has to leave him. Before his departure, however, he explains the reasons for his actions. By scuttling the boat, he actually saved it for its owners because pirates were on their way to steal it. As it is, the fishermen can salvage it. The handsome young man was on his way to commit a crime, and by killing him, Khidr saved his pious parents from infamy. By restoring the wall, 2 pious young men were saved from ruin because their treasure was buried under it. Moses, who had been so morally indignant, saw now, too late, that his judgment had been too hasty. Khidr's doings had seemed to be totally evil, but in fact they were not. Looking at this story naively, one might assume that Khidr is the lawless, capricious, evil shadow of pious, law-abiding Moses. But this is not the case. Khidr is much more the personification of some secret creative actions of the Godhead. One can find a similar meaning in the famous Indian story of the king and the corpse, as interpreted by Henry Zimmer. It is no accident that I have not quoted a dream to illustrate this subtle problem. I have chosen this well-known story from the Quran because it sums up the experience of a lifetime which would very rarely be expressed with such clarity in an individual dream. When dark figures turn up in our dreams and seem to want something, we cannot be sure whether they personify merely a shadowy part of ourselves, or the self, or both at the same time. Divining in advance whether our dark partner symbolizes a shortcoming that we should overcome, or a meaningful bit of life that we should accept, this is one of the most difficult problems that we encounter on the way to individuation. Moreover, the dream symbols are often so subtle and complicated that one cannot be sure of their interpretation. In such a situation, all one can do is accept the discomfort of ethical doubt, making no final decisions or commitments, and continuing to watch the dreams. This resembles the situation of Cinderella, when her stepmother threw a heap of good and bad peas in front of her and asked her to sort them out. Although it seemed quite hopeless, Cinderella began patiently to sort the peas, and suddenly doves, or ants in some versions, came to help her. These creatures symbolize helpful, deeply unconscious impulses that can only be felt in one's body, as it were, and that point to a way out. Somewhere, right at the bottom of one's own being, one generally does know where one should go and what one should do. But there are times when the clown we call I behaves in such a distracting fashion that the inner voice cannot make its presence felt. Sometimes all attempts to understand the hints of the unconscious fail, and in such a difficulty one can only have the courage to do what seems to be right, while being ready to change course if the suggestions of the unconscious should suddenly point in another direction. It may also happen, although this is unusual, that a person will find it better to resist the urge of the unconscious, even at the price of feeling warped by doing so, rather than depart too far from the state of being human. This would be the situation of people who had to live out a criminal disposition in order to be completely themselves. The strength and inner clarity needed by the ego in order to make such a decision stems secretly from the great man, who apparently does not want to reveal himself too clearly. It may be that the self wants the ego to make a free choice, or it may be that the self depends on human consciousness and its decisions to help him to become manifest. When it comes to such difficult ethical problems, no one can truly judge the deeds of others. Each man has to look to his own problem and try to determine what is right for himself. As an old Zen Buddhist master said, we must follow the example of the cowherd, who watches his ox with a stick so that it will not graze on other people's meadows. These new discoveries of depth psychology are bound to make some change in our collective ethical views, for they will compel us to judge all human actions in a much more individual and subtle way. End of Side 5. To continue, turn the cassette over. Side 6. Man and His Symbols, by Carl G. Jung. Continuing with the process of individuation, on page 176. The discovery of the unconscious is one of the most far-reaching discoveries of recent times, but the fact that recognition of its unconscious reality involves honest self-examination and reorganization of one's life causes many people to continue to behave as if nothing at all has happened. It takes a lot of courage to take the unconscious seriously and to tackle the problems it raises. Most people are too indolent to think deeply about even those moral aspects of their behavior of which they are conscious. They are certainly too lazy to consider how the unconscious affects them. The anima, the woman within. Difficult and subtle ethical problems are not invariably brought up by the appearance of the shadow itself. Often another inner figure emerges. If the dreamer is a man, he will discover a female personification of his unconscious, and it will be a male figure in the case of a woman. Often this second symbolic figure turns up behind the shadow, bringing up new and different problems. Jung called its male and female forms animus and anima. The anima is a personification of all feminine psychological tendencies in a man's psyche, such as vague feelings and moods, prophetic hunches, receptiveness to the irrational, capacity for personal love, feeling for nature, and, last but not least, his relation to the unconscious. It is no mere chance that in olden times priestesses, like the Greek Sibyl, were used to fathom the divine will and to make connection with the gods. A particularly good example of how the anima is experienced as an inner figure in a man's psyche is found in the medicine men and prophets, shamans, among the Eskimo and other Arctic tribes. Some of these even wear women's clothes or have breasts depicted on their garments in order to manifest their inner feminine side, the side that enables them to connect with the ghost land, that is, what we call the unconscious. One reported case tells of a young man who was being initiated by an older shaman and who was buried by him in a snow hole. He fell into a state of dreaminess and exhaustion. In this coma, he suddenly saw a woman who emitted light. She instructed him in all he needed to know, and later, as his protective spirit, helped him to practice his difficult profession by relating him to the powers of the beyond. Such an experience shows the anima as the personification of a man's unconscious. In its individual manifestation, the character of a man's anima is as a rule shaped by his mother. If he feels that his mother had a negative influence on him, his anima will often express itself in irritable, depressed moods, uncertainty, insecurity, and touchiness. If, however, he is able to overcome the negative assaults on himself, they can even serve to reinforce his masculinity. Within the soul of such a man, the negative mother anima figure will endlessly repeat this theme. I am nothing. Nothing makes any sense. With others it's different, but for me, I enjoy nothing. These anima moods cause a sort of dullness, a fear of disease, of impotence, or of accidents. The whole of life takes on a sad and oppressive aspect. Such dark moods can even lure a man to suicide, in which case the anima becomes a death demon. She appears in this role in Cocteau's film Orphée. The French call such an anima figure a femme fatale. A milder version of this dark anima is personified by the Queen of the Night in Mozart's Magic Flute. The Greek sirens, or the German Lorelei, also personify this dangerous aspect of the anima, which in this form symbolizes destructive illusion. The following Siberian tale illustrates the behavior of such a destructive anima. One day, a lonely hunter sees a beautiful woman emerging from the deep forest on the other side of the river. She waves at him and sings, "Oh, come, lonely hunter, in the stillness of dusk. Come, come, I miss you, I miss you. Now I will embrace you, embrace you. Come, come, my nest is near, my nest is near. Come, come, lonely hunter, now in the stillness of dusk." He throws off his clothes and swims across the river, but suddenly she flies away in the form of an owl, laughing mockingly at him. When he tries to swim back to find his clothes, he drowns in the cold river. In this tale, the anima symbolizes an unreal dream of love, happiness, and maternal warmth, her nest, a dream that lures men away from reality. The hunter is drowned because he ran after a wishful fantasy that could not be fulfilled. Another way in which the negative anima in a man's personality can be revealed is in waspish, poisonous, effeminate remarks by which he devalues everything. Remarks of this sort always contain a cheap twisting of the truth and are in a subtle way destructive. There are legends throughout the world in which a poisoned damsel, as they call her in the Orient, appears. She is a beautiful creature who has weapons hidden in her body or a secret poison with which she kills her lovers during their first night together. In this guise, the anima is as cold and reckless as certain uncanny aspects of nature itself, and in Europe is often expressed to this day by the belief in witches. If, on the other hand, a man's experience of his mother has been positive, this can also affect his anima in typical but different ways, with the result that he either becomes effeminate or is preyed upon by women, and thus is unable to cope with the hardships of life. An anima of this sort can turn men into sentimentalists, or they may become as touchy as old maids, or as sensitive as the fairy tale princess who could feel a pea under 30 mattresses. A still more subtle manifestation of a negative anima appears in some fairy tales in the form of a princess who asks her suitors to answer a series of riddles, or perhaps to hide themselves under her nose. If they cannot give the answers, or if she can find them, they must die, and she invariably wins. The anima in this guise involves men in a destructive intellectual game. We can notice the effect of this anima trick in all those neurotic pseudo-intellectual dialogues that inhibit a man from getting into direct touch with life and its real decisions. He reflects about life so much that he cannot live it, and loses all his spontaneity and outgoing feeling. The most frequent manifestation of the anima takes the form of erotic fantasy. Men may be driven to nurse their fantasies by looking at films and striptease shows, or by daydreaming over pornographic material. This is a crude, primitive aspect of the anima, which becomes compulsive only when a man does not sufficiently cultivate his feeling relationships, when his feeling attitude toward life has remained infantile. All these aspects of the anima have the same tendency that we have observed in the shadow. That is, they can be projected so that they appear to the man to be the qualities of some particular woman. It is the presence of the anima that causes a man to fall suddenly in love when he sees a woman for the first time and knows at once that this is she. In this situation, the man feels as if he has known this woman intimately for all time. He falls for her so helplessly that it looks to outsiders like complete madness. Women who are of fairy-like character especially attract such anima projections, because men can attribute almost anything to a creature who is so fascinatingly vague, and can thus proceed to weave fantasies around her. The projection of the anima in such a sudden and passionate form as a love affair can greatly disturb a man's marriage, and can lead to the so-called human triangle, with its accompanying difficulties. A bearable solution to such a drama can be found only if the anima is recognized as an inner power. The secret aim of the unconscious in bringing about such an entanglement is to force a man to develop and to bring his own being to maturity by integrating more of his unconscious personality and bringing it into his real life. But I have said enough about the negative side of the anima. There are just as many important positive aspects. The anima is, for instance, responsible for the fact that a man is able to find the right marriage partner. Another function is at least equally important. Whenever a man's logical mind is incapable of discerning facts that are hidden in his unconscious, the anima helps him to dig them out. Even more vital is the role that the anima plays in putting a man's mind in tune with the right inner values, and thereby opening the way into more profound inner depths. It is as if an inner radio becomes tuned to a certain wavelength that excludes irrelevancies, but allows the voice of the great man to be heard. In establishing this inner radio reception, the anima takes on the role of guide or mediator to the world within and to the self. That is how she appears in the example of the initiations of shamans that I described earlier. This is the role of Beatrice in Dante's Paradiso, and also of the goddess Isis, when she appeared in a dream to Apuleius, the famous author of the Golden Ass, in order to initiate him into a higher, more spiritual form of life. The dream of a 45-year-old psychotherapist may help to make clear how the anima can be an inner guide. As he was going to bed on the evening before he had this dream, he thought to himself that it was hard to stand alone in life, lacking the support of a church. He found himself envying people who are protected by the maternal embrace of an organization. He had been born a Protestant, but no longer had any religious affiliation. This was his dream. I am in the aisle of an old church, filled with people. Together with my mother and my wife, I sit at the end of the aisle in what seem to be extra seats. I am to celebrate the Mass as a priest, and I have a big Mass book in my hands, or rather a prayer book or an anthology of poems. This book is not familiar to me, and I cannot find the right text. I am very excited because I have to begin soon, and, to add to my troubles, my mother and wife disturb me by chattering about unimportant trifles. Now the organ stops, and everybody is waiting for me, so I get up in a determined way and ask one of the nuns who is kneeling behind me to hand me her Mass book and point out the right place, which she does in an obliging manner. Now, like a sort of sexton, This same nun precedes me to the altar, which is somewhere behind me and to the left, as if we are approaching it from a side aisle. The Mass book is like a sheet of pictures, a sort of board, 3 feet long and a foot wide, and on it is the text with ancient pictures in columns, one beside the other. First, the nun has to read a part of the liturgy before I begin, and I have still not found the right place in the text. She has told me that it is number 15, but the numbers are not clear, and I cannot find it. With determination, however, I turn toward the congregation, and now I have found number 15, the next to the last on the board, although I do not yet know if I shall be able to decipher it. I want to try all the same. I wake up. This dream expressed in a symbolic way an answer from the unconscious to the thoughts that the dreamer had had the evening before. It said to him, in effect, "You yourself must become a priest in your own inner church, in the church of your soul." Thus, the dream shows that the dreamer does have the helpful support of an organization. He is contained in a church, not an external church, but one that exists inside his own soul. The people, all his own psychic qualities, want him to function as the priest and celebrate the Mass himself. Now, the dream cannot mean the actual Mass, for its Mass book is very different from the real one. It seems that the idea of the Mass is used as a symbol, and therefore it means a sacrificial act in which the divinity is present, so that man can communicate with it. This symbolic solution is, of course, not generally valid, but relates to this particular dreamer. It is a typical solution for a Protestant, because a man who through real faith is still contained in the Catholic Church usually experiences his anima in the image of the Church herself, and her sacred images are for him the symbols of the unconscious. Our dreamer did not have this ecclesiastical experience, and this is why he had to follow an inner way. Furthermore, the dream told him what he should do. It said, "Your mother-boundness and your extroversion," represented by the wife who is an extrovert, "distract you and make you feel insecure, and by meaningless talk keep you from celebrating the inner Mass. But if you follow the nun, the introverted anima, she will lead you as both a servant and a priest. She owns a strange Mass book, which is composed of 16, 4 times 4, ancient pictures. Your Mass consists of your contemplation of these psychic images that your religious anima reveals to you. In other words, if the dreamer overcomes his inner uncertainty, caused by his mother complex, he will find that his life task has the nature and quality of a religious service, and that if he meditates about the symbolic meaning of the images in his soul, they will lead him to this realization." In this dream, the anima appears in her proper positive role, that is, as a mediator between the ego and the self. The 4 times 4 configuration of the pictures points to the fact that the celebration of this inner Mass is performed in the service of totality. As Jung has demonstrated, the nucleus of the psyche, the self, normally expresses itself in some kind of fourfold structure. The number 4 is also connected with the anima because, as Jung noted, there are 4 stages in its development. The first stage is best symbolized by the figure of Eve, which represents purely instinctual and biological relations. The second can be seen in Faust's Helen. She personifies a romantic and aesthetic level that is, however, still characterized by sexual elements. The third is represented, for instance, by the Virgin Mary, a figure who raises love, eros, to the heights of spiritual devotion. The fourth type is symbolized by sapientia, wisdom transcending even the most holy and the most pure. Of this, another symbol is the Shulamite in the Song of Solomon. In the psychic development of modern man, this stage is rarely reached. The Mona Lisa comes nearest to such a wisdom anima. At this stage, I am only pointing out that the concept of fourfoldness frequently occurs in certain types of symbolic material. The essential aspects of this will be discussed later. But what does the role of the anima as guide to the inner world mean in practical terms? This positive function occurs when a man takes seriously the feelings, moods, expectations, and fantasies sent by his anima, and when he fixes them in some form, for example, in writing, painting, sculpture, musical composition, or dancing. When he works at this patiently and slowly, Other, more deeply unconscious material wells up from the depths and connects with the earlier material. After a fantasy has been fixed in some specific form, it must be examined both intellectually and ethically with an evaluating feeling reaction. And it is essential to regard it as being absolutely real. There must be no lurking doubt that this is only a fantasy. If this is practiced with devotion over a long period, the process of individuation gradually becomes the single reality and can unfold in its true form. Many examples from literature show the anima as a guide and mediator to the inner world. Francesco Colonna's Hypnerotomachia, Rider Haggard's She, or the eternal feminine in Goethe's Faust. In a medieval mystical text, an anima figure explains her own nature as follows. I am the flower of the field and the lily of the valleys. I am the mother of fair love and of fear and of knowledge and of holy hope. I am the mediator of the elements, making one to agree with another. That which is warm I make cold, and the reverse, and that which is dry I make moist, and the reverse, and that which is hard I soften. I am the law in the priest, and the word in the prophet, and the counsel in the wise. I will kill, and I will make to live, and there is none that can deliver out of my hand.